Um, so we have two incredibly impressive presenters, speakers today. And so you'll hear how impressive they are by their intros. So just bear with me as I get through the intros because there's so much to say about each of them. So first of all, our own Juliette Mayers. Juliette is celebrating 10 years in business. She's the founder and CEO of Inspiration Zone, a strategic consulting firm specializing in diversity and inclusion strategy, brand management, and thought leadership. And in addition to running her business, she's a fellow at the Simmons University Institute for Inclusive Leadership and a member of Forbes Coaches Council. When it comes to diversity and inclusion, Juliette is unapologetic about her business-focused orientation. With 30 years of leadership experience with Fortune 500 companies and large not-for-profits, she helps organizations create diverse and inclusive workspaces with built-in accountability. A trusted advisor and confidant to CEOs and senior executives, Juliette uses her influence to position brands for DEI success in the global marketplace. In addition to leading her award-winning consulting practice, Juliette is a published author of 2 books. She motivates and inspires audiences through her books, keynotes, and workshops on unconscious bias, inclusive leadership, strategic networking, personal branding, and women's leadership. Juliette serves on the Mass Higher State Workforce Board, where she was appointed by Governor Charlie Baker. She is a member of the Boston Women's Workforce Council and is Emeritus Board President of Action for Boston Community Development. She's a passionate advocate for women and people of color. Her awards and accolades are numerous. Juliette was recently acknowledged by Get Connected as one of Boston's most impactful Black women in 2021. And that is very impressive. Andrea Silbert. Andrea is president of EOS Foundation, Women Leading Change. Andrea joined the EOS Foundation as its first president in 2007. EOS is a private philanthropic foundation which focuses on fighting hunger and supporting gender and racial justice. In 1995, Andrea founded and served as the CEO for the Center for Women in Enterprise, one of the largest nonprofit entrepreneurial training centers in the country. CWE has served entrepreneurs ranging from owners of small home-based businesses to the founders of fast-growth technology companies such as Zipcar and iRobot. Andrea served as the founding president of the Association of Women's Business Centers, meeting with congressional leaders to promote legislation to assist women-owned small businesses. In 2000, she was appointed to the National Women's Business Council, which provided advice to Congress and the president on issues of concern to women entrepreneurs, particularly around access to capital and government procurement. Andrea was a co-founder of Springboard Enterprises, a national organization which has helped fast growth women entrepreneurs raise over $2 billion in angel financing and venture capital. A nationally recognized advocate in the area of economic empowerment, Andrea was selected in 2000 by Working Woman magazine, alongside Gloria Steinem, as one of only 25 leaders in the past 25 years who have given women in the workplace a better shot. Andrea is vice chair of the Alliance for Business Leadership and vice chair of the Harwich Conservation Trust. She is a graduate of Harvard University, where she earned an MBA, a Master of Public Administration, and a BA in economics. So, wow, our 2 speakers are awesome. So I give it to you. Take it away.
All right. Hi, everyone. I want to just start by saying it's great to see you. I'm really excited, actually, that we have an intimate group, and I'm looking forward to really having a conversation. I also want to just thank Nancy, thank Constance, and thank the Boston Club, not only for having me, but because you are doing some of the work that I'm going to talk about, which is at the individual level, looking at companies and saying, you know, how many people are on your boards? And that is hard work to do. And you'll hear in just a minute about how we're using that approach to drive change much more quickly. So I'm going to share my screen. Bear with me for one moment. And this will take, oh, I don't know, maybe 6-8 minutes. It won't take long. but I'm going to power through this. So you'll probably have a lot of questions, and not to worry. And also anybody who would like the slides afterwards, please make sure to, I'll talk about how you can get in touch with me. Okay, so the EOS Foundation launched in 2018 an initiative called the Women's Power Gap, because we noticed that, frankly, in a number of sectors, women were backsliding. You know, you hear these stats about, oh, by 2070, this is so terrible, by 2070, we'll reach gender parity. Well, not if you're backsliding, right? So those used to bother me quite a bit. The goal of the Women's Power Gap Initiative is to dramatically increase the number of women from diverse backgrounds. We really focus on women of color in top leadership positions across all sectors of our economy. Our approach is very much to look at the C-suite or the equivalent, the glass ceiling, not the executive vice president, not the senior vice presidents, but why aren't we getting that last step? That's where we're stuck. We look at the path to the president's office in higher ed. We've done a ton of work in higher ed, the CEO's office in corporations. One key area of our approach is that we disaggregate our analysis by gender, race, and ethnicity. So we look at, if there are 8 census categories, which there are, we look at 16. We look at how are Black men doing? How are Black women doing? How are Indigenous men doing? How are Indigenous women doing? Because when you group things into gender, we see that white women get ahead. When we group things into race, we see that men of color get ahead, or certain, even within people of color, certain groups get ahead. So you really have to have a disaggregated analysis. And the real driver, we think, of change with our approach has been that we use comparative analysis and rankings wherever possible. So we'll list, for instance, we did the 25 largest public companies in Massachusetts, and we rank them. We give weights to certain, how many women are on their board, how many are in the CEO's office, how many are on the management team. So that's the Women's Power Gap approach. So hold on, I just want to see if that's the next slide. It's going a little slowly. Okay, so one of our most recent reports was looking at the elite universities nationally. We started our work off with looking at Massachusetts, all colleges and universities, and we realized very quickly that the largest gender and racial gaps existed in these elite universities, the Harvards, the UMasses, the Kansas State, the big schools, top 10. And we looked at, this was a new report for us, we looked at pay. And we found that men at these universities held 3 out of 4 of the top earning core positions. Those are sort of the academic and administrative positions at these R1s. Not only that, when a lot of these major universities run medical centers, well, women were only 12% of the top paid there. And among the athletic staff, directors of athletic, football coaches, basketball coaches, women were only 7%. Sorry, I'm having trouble making my slides go. Sorry about that. Oops. I'm sorry. You'll have to bear with me on this. Okay. Among the top earners, women of color were virtually non-existent. So women of color received 16% of all PhDs. So they want to get to the top of these fields in higher ed, but only 2% of the top earners. One thing that was really interesting, as I mentioned, we disaggregate. So we've got white men, white women, Asian men, Asian women, Black men, Black women, and Hispanic men and Hispanic women. One of the really interesting things is look at the Asian sample. Asian men are overrepresented among the top earning positions in higher education. Asian women are not. They're really at the same low levels as Black and Hispanic women. That was a big insight and something we actually haven't seen nationally. I think a lot of people say, well, Asian women are doing fine because the gender pay gap is less, but this is a different look. This is at the very top. It's not just average salaries. So We did, as I mentioned, we started off in 2018 looking at all of the colleges and universities in Massachusetts, both community colleges and the large universities. So we have 3 years now of data, and we went back in 2021 to see what the progress had been. So it's pretty interesting. Overall, there was slow progress for women. There was a little progress, 33% of the presidents to 36%. What we learned though, we not only did we publish this data 2 years in a row, it's critical to publish to stay on it so it's not just a blip. What we learned is, and we brought the presidents together. We worked with Lee Pelton, who I know is a big supporter of the Boston Club and we all know well, and Larry Bacow from Harvard. And when we got those two to form the core of a committee to convene, we brought a number of the presidents together, about 40 of them. And there was real intentionality. The discussion was about the low number of women of color college presidents. And a number of searches have happened in the last 3 years. And it's just really exciting to report that women of color presidents increased from 6% to 13% of the sample, went from 5 in 2018 to 11. And a number of these searches reached out. We know that they were very intentional. So it's it sort of takes away that whole notion of there's not a pipeline of women of color, we can't find them. Well, you can when you try. Unfortunately, there are no Hispanic or Latina or Indigenous women among the presidents. There were modest gains for men of color, and community colleges still lead the way with 40% women and 33% women of color. Going back to the R1, the elite universities, they have the furthest to go. There are no women presidents among the 8 Massachusetts R1s, so that those are the MIT, the Tufts, the Harvard, UMass, Amherst. But we did make progress. There are 2 women board chairs in this group. There were 0 when we started. So our learnings are that comparative analysis drives change. You know, some people say this is naming and shaming. I think that is absolutely untrue. We call it spotlighting, and I also call it transparency. And I believe in radical transparency. I think things need to be out there for us to tackle them. So we do, as much as possible, we recognize schools that are leading on gender parity and racial representation, and we provide examples that it can be achieved. So pretty much when you interview, and we did interview a number of these schools, they say we're doing everything we can to promote women and people of color to the top. And when they see that somebody is doing better than them, they realize they aren't. Nobody's doing everything that they can. We highlight schools that are lagging. It doesn't make people happy, but it's essential. You know, you're lagging. You need to get on this. And we include qualitative analysis, case studies, and interviews, which are just so important to understand the stories of individuals who are facing discrimination. As I've mentioned many times, you have to disaggregate the data and look at intersectional data. The convening is essential to tackle systemic challenges. You've got to bring them together. And intentionality and transparency work. It's not a pipeline issue. This is just an example of our ranking. So you'll see that we have the name of the university. We often look at the enrollment. Women are the vast majority of students in higher ed. Have you ever had a female president, provost, your senior team, the board? We looked at salaries, and then we came up with points. So that is our system, and we've applied it to a number of different industries, and I'm really excited to speak with you in this fireside chat and turn it over to Juliet.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you for leading this effort, multi-year effort. It really makes a difference, and it takes courage. So congratulations. We appreciate all the data that you've collected.
It helps. I'm just going to say it helps to be an endowed foundation. It is very hard. You know, I've run nonprofits. It's very hard when you are dependent on the corporate sector.
Yeah.
Right. So we feel that it's really important that we do it because we are able to do it, and not everybody is able to take on these challenges. So thank you, Juliet.
Sure, sure. One place I would love to start, I love the fact that you disaggregate the data. because so many times you hear all of these wonderful accomplishments of organizations that have increased their women and people of color, et cetera, right? 60% or some, wonderful number. And when you dig below the surface, you usually find out, what you have seen in the data, that unfortunately, people of color, there's still a huge gap. And that was one of the things that stood out. But I want to start by first talking about the data. Give us a little more insight into how it was collected
Mhm.
and any surprises that came up during that process.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the biggest surprise, but it's not a surprise, but the biggest concern is that it's extremely hard to find data, extremely hard. And that's why we started with higher ed, because there's more data available on higher ed leaders and on salaries, because they have to file that in many states. So first of all, there are just a number of organizations. Actually, in higher ed, they keep track of it, but they don't make it public. But there are a number of organizations, actually public boards and commissions in Massachusetts. I'm testifying today on a piece of legislation called Parity on Board, trying to provide goals for women and people of color on public boards and commissions. They don't even keep track. So number one, they have to keep track. Now the corporations are keeping track, but they don't want to publish it. Some of the best corporations put DE&I reports out every year with goals, but they're not fully disaggregated. They're not.
Right.
They definitely don't get down to Black women, Black men. They might say all women, and they might say all Black people at the best. But I spoke to a leader at Deloitte, and he actually said their goals were intersectional, but they don't publish them. So number one, I would say is we need to legislate that this information needs to be made public. So what we do is we look online. We do it all online, and our data for gender is much more robust because we can look at pronouns. We can look at photos. It's very hard for me, for instance, to look at a person of color and say, is that person Black? Is that person multiracial? Is that person Hispanic? So we're very limited. We are able to be, among CEOs and board chairs, we are able to get a pretty good guess, which is accurate around race, because they're public figures and usually there's more information. So once we gather the data, we go back to the in this case, the universities, and say, here's your data. And here's your gender data. Could you verify it? And would you please give us racial data? Would you please give that to us? So not quite half of all of the universities have given us racial data. So we do have aggregate racial data, but we can't hold each university accountable for individual racial data. So that's how we do it. And it's extraordinarily time-taking. I have 2 full-time people working on this and a number of consultants, but we really think it's moving the needle.
Yeah, got to start somewhere, right?
Yes,
So good.
absolutely.
Great. And you did a similar report on the corporate side. Curious what, if anything, you found in terms of commonalities or differences there, and perhaps things
Yeah,
that we can learn. Yeah.
yeah. So we looked at the largest 25 corporations, and I know that you also look at the largest corporations for your census. We looked at them, and we looked at who are the highest paid executives.
Mhm.
We looked at who they put on the website as their executive leadership team. We looked at their boards, and we also looked at the various committees. So did they have a female lead director? Did they have a female audit chair, nominating committee, a few of the key committees, and we ranked them. And so what we found is a huge variation, which is good news and bad news. The good news is, for instance, Bright Horizons was number 1, as I remember. They were able to find women. Now you might say, oh, that's childcare, but it's a corporation, just like any other. I mean, so many corporations are selling cosmetics and there's no women, in their senior leadership. So there were also, the other surprise from doing that was that a few of the biotechs had more diversity and had some women of color. And now we saw that, is it Vertex? I think it was Vertex, where there's a woman CEO. So there's been some progress within the biotechs. It's really quite interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, it's great to see some areas of progress. And at the same time, we both know that this is a much bigger issue, right? It's not just about uh, hiring people, but also creating environments where people can thrive and feel supported, feel valued, included, and all of that. And so I'm wondering, as you looked at what some of the causes were, you talked about some of the things that you believe were some of the challenges. What would you say are some of the top challenges, issues that you found in advancing women?
Yeah, I think the top challenges are this approach, which is not our approach. So our approach is let's find systems change issues. And I do want to say that this keeping women, like oftentimes women will get the top spot and will not be supported by their boards. And at the first sign of trouble, they get the boot. So that we should talk about that. But back to your question, I think that if we only have anonymous aggregated data, right? So typically, the Boston Women's Workforce Council, for instance, I work very closely with Evelyn Murphy, who is one of the leaders getting that going. Mm-hmm. They get aggregate data from 250 of the good guys, employers, and the wage gaps increased in the last 7 years. And these are the good guys. And the good guys and gals are training women and people of color to be more like traditional leaders, more like white male leaders. So it's basically a deficiency-based approach, and it hasn't gotten us anywhere. We've been doing that for 30 years.
Yeah.
So the challenge is to convince the CEOs that, in fact, it isn't the women and people of color that need the training. It's actually the executives, the white executives, who need the training, because they have unconscious bias. We all do, no blame attached to it. Yeah. And their processes don't work to help women and people of color get to the top and stay at the top. So that's the greatest challenge. I mean, that so much of our work is congratulatory to these few companies that are doing these training programs, but they're not working. They're not working. The other thing that's really difficult is you've got this so-called Rooney Rule. I don't know if any of you are aware of this Rooney Rule from the NFL, where corporate America has now adopted it. And so you have to have, people of color and women in the finalist pool. Well, we looked at 8 of the last searches for presidents of state universities. And this was actually before, so they just hired a woman of color at Westfield State. But before that, most recent one, actually the most recent 2, we've had 2 victories, because I think our work is driving this. So there had been 8 searches. Women were 39% of the finalist pools, and they got none of the jobs, none. Because check the box. I think there's a lot of check the box thinking. Okay, we have the finalist pools. It's fair now. Mm-hmm. Women, Black people, Hispanic people, they were in the running, but whoop, the white guy was really the one. He was uniquely qualified. And when people say the most qualified, that drives me crazy, because that is the example of the narrow thinking. Mm-hmm. There's no most qualified. Different people have different talents that they bring. Nobody can 100% be qualified for a job. So that's the biggest challenge. We've got to change this mindset, and we have to stop, as women, allowing these leaders to get off the hook easily. Mm-hmm. We have to demand, no, it's not enough. What are the outcomes from your searches? Not whether the women were in the finalist pool. What are the outcomes? Look at the last 10 searches you did at your company for the top executive level leadership, and what were the outcomes, and hold them accountable to that.
Yeah, terrific. And so what are some of the things that corporations can do? Because most of the people while there are definitely a lot of lessons that can be learned from academia, where I was surprised by the large number of women that are represented there, but yet the top is so total reverse in terms of leadership. But taking a look at the corporate side, really, and I guess some of those lessons apply to academia as well. What are some of the things that CEOs and senior leaders can do to change the needle?
Well, I'm going to start, but I want you to share because this is your area. So I'm going to start and then we'll have a conversation. So again, start with systemic approaches. What are the walls in your corporation? Instead of pushing women over the walls, like, you know, those few superhero women who you can push them over the walls, bring the walls down. So whether that means you're holding meetings at 7 p.m. or maybe even at 4 p.m., you know, when women are getting their kids off the school bus, like figure that out. You know, I know at Harvard Business School, they stopped having meetings after 7 p.m. or 6 or 7 p.m. because it became obvious that that was problematic and that women do the lion's share of the work and make work flexible. So you can work from 10 p.m. to midnight when a lot of us are working. As I suggested, focus on the outcomes of searches, not the inputs of searches. The chief DE&I person should report to the president, but that's not enough. It should also be embedded in everyone's job. So it's a both and. Intersectional goals. So you need intersectional goals we've talked about, and you need to make them public. Nothing's going to change until people have public goals and consumers can hold these companies accountable to hitting those goals. Tie CEO pay to publishing goals and hitting goals. Debias your hiring and advancement processes. You know, we all know that fun story about how the symphony has people try out behind the curtain. What are the equivalents within corporations? And I think executives are the ones who need the unconscious bias training. It's so funny, I met with a college president a couple of years ago. We did, my team and I did. And he was really excited. A lot of people are excited to talk about what they're doing and share what they're doing. He was so excited to meet with us, and he's a great guy. And he said, "Oh, Andrea, you're going to be so excited. I had an unconscious bias training for my whole team." And he didn't go. He didn't go. But he was so happy that he trained his team. So I don't know. I'll leave you with that. And share. What do you share with me from your work, Juliet? Yeah.
That's a good one because unfortunately that's how a lot of people think. But you know, I really think I absolutely agree. It does start at the top, and something that is often overlooked is, but really needs to happen first is mindset. You know, the it's difficult to change the organization if the executive, in most cases the CEO, doesn't have the mindset set and has committed to the journey of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that often means really having difficult conversations, you know, taking a look at your own lived experience, really getting and understanding the lived experiences of the other people who you're trying to bring up and elevate throughout the organization. And so oftentimes it's this distance, you know, commit, like what you just described, classic. We're going to have training for everybody, but, you know, don't ask me to dig deeply. Don't ask me to get too involved. And to be fair, there are some who do, but most still resist that journey of, you know, delegating it to their diversity, equity, and inclusion officer, or making excuses for why they themselves can't make the tough changes that are required. So I think until we really see a fundamental shift in the mindset and commitment to that learning journey and to change at the very top, I think progress is going to be very, very difficult to, you know, to move the needle, because the leaders need to model the behaviors and the actions that they're expecting to permeate the organization.
Yeah.
There, of course, there may a lot of the other things that you commented on. Absolutely, agree with. I think the other thing that I would say before I do want to open it up to the group to have. So if you have questions, be prepared to ask them. I also think it's important as women. What are we? You know, many of us are in the Boston Club. Many of us are in lots of organizations where we are in positions to influence change. And I think, you know, not to put the burden on the women because we can't do it alone, but those of us who are in positions of influence need to use our voices and need to use our influence to help to drive that change. So it's a both and hopefully more people, as we have more data and more transparency, more people will step up and have the courage to do what you're doing, Andrea,
Yeah.
of really pushing so that we can see more advancement, more women in positions of
Yeah.
leadership and power.
Can I give one example of, it's not to say that there is no, there's only systemic. Like, I also think we need, as women, as you said, Julia, to push for ourselves. And so there's an example in our report. And if anybody wants, I have a lot of copies which I can send to you. This is the Power Gap report, the top earners. We have this fabulous example, case study of a Black woman at UPenn. Very, very impressive. Anita LaFrance Allen. And she was a professor, one of the most highly acclaimed at UPenn. And they approached her and said, could you please serve as vice provost for faculty? It's a huge job. She didn't want the job. And she said, I think I'm just going to stick with my research and my work and my teaching. And they said, no, we really want you for the job. So she said, okay, I'll consider the job. So she did a full search of, how much other vice provosts were making. And that's the great thing. Again, there's some public data. And she went to the provost and said, here's what I want to make. And his jaw dropped. And he said, well, if I paid you that, you'd be one of the most highly paid vice provosts in the country. And she just looked at him, and they were friends. And so she was brave. And she said, oh my gosh, are you saying I'm at UPenn? Are you saying, why wouldn't I be one of the most highly paid vice provosts in the country? And he realized he had made a gender and racial subconscious, that she didn't look like she would be one of the highest paid. And he apologized, and she got her package.
Excellent example. And there's so many other stories. And it also reminded me, the reality of it is there are very different experiences. Talk about intersectionality, right? For women of color. And it's important that as we lean into this and start to look at it, that we try to have a better understanding of that. I had actually written an article on the topic, the reality of realities for women of color in the workplace. And it's a very, very difficult journey. One, you're often the only one, right? and so you have all the other challenges, and then that intersectional point of being the only Black woman, being the only Latina, or whatever your identity is, that presents a problem for others, not so much for the individual, but for others. And if you don't have that support and people don't understand those intersectional identities, and they don't understand how to make things a little more equitable. And I want to sort of give a definition here, because I know you mentioned, Andrea, you alluded to it, but the difference between equality and equity, because oftentimes we talk about making sure that things are equitable, and so many people are not really clear on what that is. So I want to just sort of bear with me as I sort of try to illustrate it for you. So equality is treating everybody the same, right? And equity is really about making the adjustments that are necessary to ensure that people have the opportunity to be successful. So one of the picture images for this that are often used is, you're on a field, and there's a family trying to look over a fence at a game, let's call it a baseball game, and you have the mother, father, and a child, and they're all standing in front of the fence, and of course the child cannot see over the fence. So a demonstration of equity would be to provide a crate for the child to stand on the fence to be able to see over, so that everybody is able to see the game. Same applies in the workplace, and there's not enough attention applied and attributed to that for those who are from marginalized communities, who are at a significant disadvantage, not even on the same playing field sometimes. It is important that we take into account what is necessary to support people who may be isolated, who may not have had the same opportunities. In this case, the professor you described was very savvy, had a lot of access to information and knowledge, but people are often in circumstances where they may not even know what to ask for. And so, as women, we have to advocate for each other, but also push to make sure that it's not just equal practices, but equitable practices by helping to educate people on how to do that.
Juliet and Andrea, we have a couple of questions in the chat.
Perfect.
You want to take a look?
Yeah. So let's see here. And this is most heartening, Andrea, and dedicated effort. Much of it mirrors the work of the Commonwealth Compact years ago in the higher education, which grew out of the. Do you have access to their data?
No, I don't. Who mentions
That was
Anne?
Anne.
Would you tell me a little bit more?
Yeah, I'll be happy to try to access some of that data for you. It was started in 2008, and it was centered at UMass Boston when Keith Motley was still in charge. And Steve Crosby was the head of their public policy graduate school.
Yep.
And headed this up as well. The struggles that you talk about were just as pervasive then, the reluctance to release information, but they did carry on for 3 years comparing statistics that organizations were giving them, all in an effort to try to make the entire state of Massachusetts a more attractive place for professionals of color. I will do what I can to see how we can access that data. It's available in print. I've got a copy of it here.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
But it is a follow-on on what you're doing, and which I actually find most heartening, because people ran out of steam. And people were running up against legal firms in particular who wouldn't release a thing, thinking that it would jeopardize their integrity or make them liable. So
Yeah.
I will.
You know,
I'll be in
Steve,
touch.
I think Steve's a real ally, Steve Crosby. And he had mentioned that to me. So I would love
Good.
to see that if you can put your hands on it, or I can just borrow the report and make a copy. Or yes, Steve is a real ally, and he's been very interested in our work. But
Good.
I
I'm
haven't.
glad you've
he'd
been in
mentioned
touch.
it. Yeah, I know Steve going way back. And that is the thing. It's really critical for us to have some of the guys involved.
Yeah, and it's really critical not to reinvent the wheel, to take advantage of the distance that we did travel, because it makes your work even better.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anne.
You bet. We'll be in touch.
Thanks. You know, the pandemic, there's been a lot of talk about what the impact of the pandemic has been on women. And I'm wondering if, I know that you're not in a research phase right now. Well, you probably are, but in terms of, wasn't specifically focused on the pandemic. Just curious, though, what your thoughts are in terms of what the impact of a lot of the women who have now opted out because they cannot, have had to, can't shoulder all of the numerous demands that are being put upon them while, whether it's taking care of their kids and the elder parents, and so many of people can relate to that. Just curious what you think can be done about that, and do you expect that we will have slippage, or what are your thoughts on what organizations can do to address that?
Yeah, well, we are going to have slippage. I mean, if you think about in higher ed, women who are on the tenure track getting off of it, it's really hard to get back on, really hard. And the most that they can hope for is to get back on and have a longer track. But if enlightened presidents would think about, well, diversity in and of itself at the top is important, so maybe we should add that in when we're thinking about it. So sadly, and some, two of the great leaders in Massachusetts are Lynn Perry Wooten at Simmons and Marissa Kelly at Suffolk. And they're both talking about, really re-examining the tenure track. And that's the same, equivalent for corporate America. If all you do is say, oh yeah, here, have a paid leave, and then you come back in and you're off track, it's really hard to get on track. So everybody, I'm hopeful about childcare. Something is going to happen. I don't know if you are all aware of the Common Start Coalition in Massachusetts that's pushing for a significant increase in childcare. And the Mass Business Roundtable has supported it, as had the Alliance for Business Leadership. So the Alliance, which I'm vice chair of, we're pretty progressive. So of course we would have supported it, but to have the Mass Business Roundtable support it is big. So I think these two pillars, the power gap and the pay gap at the top, and the childcare, I think these two both have to be attacked. And I use that word, attacked, in order to get anywhere. Maybe there's some benefit too at the same time, though, because we've proved that we can work virtually and flexibly. And again, I don't know, I was saying when we were in the quote green room, when we were talking before time, you know, that I feel like as a single mom with 3 kids, they're grown up now, but when I was doing that, I was working full time. I feel like I was so much more efficient that I could do what a guy could do in like 25% of the time at work. So I think hopefully we can prove that. So maybe there's some hope with us being able to work at home virtually. And the last thing I'll say is that, again, on the positive, one of my dear friends who's really quite senior at a financial services firm, she wanted to work from home 1 day a week. This is prior to the pandemic. And she felt so guilty about doing that and asking for it that she ended up taking 80% pay. She was working 50, 60 hours a week, but she took 80% pay. This is not uncommon.
No. Leslie, I'm sorry, go ahead, finish.
Yeah, so this, hopefully that changes out of this.
Thank you. Leslie, you had a couple questions. I want to make sure you get in there.
You're on mute, Leslie.
You're on mute, Les. No, you're still on mute.
You're on mute.
I was just worrying about being the only, and it actually works the opposite for us. We're all female, and so when you're interviewing and the guys see that there'd be the only, there are some that have sisters or whatever, just are confident and don't care. But it takes a brave person to be the only. So what are you doing to, is there research how to make, obviously, once there were 2 Black faces on my website of people, then it attracted resumes of people of color, because they saw that they wouldn't be the only. So I feel like it's not just, it's sort of like making that, I know it sounds terrible though, but I don't know, what would work to get people so that, and when Juliet said, we're always the only, and that just breaks my heart, you just shouldn't feel like you're the only.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how you fix that.
Yeah, well, if I can comment on it, the reality of it is, somebody has to be first, right? And unfortunately, the power structure is such that if you wait not to be the only, you just may not have the opportunity. But you raise a very good point. It's important that as we're looking at organizational development and leadership and so forth, that we're looking more broadly and not and including, this applies to boards as well, and not engaging in tokenism, right? Of, okay, I have one of that, so I'm good, but really looking at how can the organization be more representative. So it gets back to the representation. For me, it gets back to representation, and how can you make sure that representation is inclusive, and that the people who are there feel like they're supported, feel like there are other people like them, feel like, and even if they are the only one, that they have some sort of support system, getting back to that equity piece again, to ensure that they are supported and that they can be successful, giving them what they need to be successful. And it comes down to, quite frankly, in a lot of cases, asking, right? Because sometimes you don't know what people need, but having the conversation with them. I don't know if you had anything to add to that, Andrea.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's a few things that you can do. So at the Alliance for Business Leadership, we wanted to add more diversity to our board. And so we added a cohort, and that really helped. So we went, we made it's a big decision. We went from maybe 16 board members to 21. So yeah, that worked. And we brought in a cohort of all people of color.
Okay.
The other thing.
Oh, Go ahead.
The other thing you can do is, so I have a girlfriend who just joined a while ago, joined the eBay board. You can say, you know, there's some women who are very hotly pursued, and some people of color, you know, and they tend to sit on every single board. You know, if some of those women would say, I'll join, but I need to know that the next 2 people are going to be women or people of color. I think that's the way to do it.
Joanne has a question. We'll make that the last question.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thanks, Andrea and Juliet. So I was really interested in you talking about academia and, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Academia and publishing the search statistics. And in the last couple of years, I've worked with at least 5 very skilled and experienced and qualified scientists who have been applying for chair positions. And I've seen a real lack of transparency in the process and the outcome. And I wonder 2 things: how to encourage or mandate more of that transparency after the process. This is who came through the pipeline. This is who we chose. And also on the opportunity for search firms to step up. Maureen is here. Maybe you've got a perspective on that, but for search firms to step up and be better advocates for having the people of color who are in the pipeline really get looked at in the way that they should, and be more advocates for the process and for a better outcome.
Well, I'll answer the first one and then we'll ask Maureen about the search firm. So the only thing that's going to change is if in higher ed, if faculty rule everything at these impressive schools. Like, I think the president's afraid of the faculty, frankly, in some of these schools. So the faculty has to demand the transparency. You know, otherwise it's not going to, they don't care what the students think. We tried an approach getting students to demand change, and they just wait the students out, they leave, and they're distracted, they're busy, they have to write their thesis. But so you got to go to the faculty and work with the faculty senate. So Maureen, let's talk about search.
2 minutes. Thank you. This has been, as always, a very enlightening conversation because it's ongoing work. From a search firm perspective, I work with a search firm and we're very intentional because we're woman founded. And we also have a CEO who is African American. And so it's a part of the pillars of what we do. And what we're doing, which is very intentional, is with every search committee, we actually present a minimizing bias dialogue to have a conversation about ways in which to mitigate bias and ensure that it's not just your pools, but it's the entire process. Now, going back to that which has been said today, if there isn't a mindset shift, even that conversation will go nowhere, right? But there is a role that the search firm can play by imposing very diverse slates and by coaching candidates of color to help them to see their way through and to understand. I have to hop to do that coaching. It just means that the search firm is carrying an even bigger sort of slate role to ensure that at the end you do land with someone who may be a little different to that which they anticipated. But not every search firm wants to take it on because it's costly. Right? It takes away from what you would normally do in a typical search. You just get your slate and it's up to the client to make a decision, but you can actually influence, and you can actually also influence the candidates as well. But it's a lot more work and not everybody's ready for it. So thanks for highlighting that. And it is an opportunity though, because therein lies a possibility to create sustainable change right there.
Thanks, Maureen. We're going to stop there. I think we could continue discussion on for hours. Thank you so much, Andrea. Thank you, Juliet, both for the research, but also for the perspectives that you bring. You've both worked in this area for a long, long time. And if we see progress, we owe it a lot of thanks to women like you and to many other women who have joined us today. So thank you all. I am happy to say that the Boston Club's latest corporate census on the 100 largest companies in Massachusetts is going to press soon, fingers crossed. And the results this year are heartening, I have to say, on several levels. Less so on a couple others, but heartening on the areas that we've been talking about today. But before the corporate salute, which is coming up on November 4th, and if you're not yet registered, we hope you will. We have some other programs, and one I particularly want to highlight is coming up on October 12th, which, believe it or not, is not that far away. Hard to believe that we're almost at the end of September. We're going to start off this year's healthcare series of programs in the club with a Massachusetts healthcare update with Mary Lou Sutters, who is the Secretary of Health and Human Services. I think if you, like many of us, were constant watchers of Governor Baker's daily press conferences, you heard Mary Lou speak on a regular basis about dealing with COVID. We're going to talk to her about that, but we're also going to talk about the general state of healthcare in the Commonwealth, the behavioral health initiative that she's heading up, a COVID update, of course, and then we also want to talk to her about how she's managed through this past year and how she deals with the stress of being in the position that she's been in. So that is a 5 o'clock meeting. It's on Tuesday, October 12th. You can register on the website, and we do hope you will join us for that. In the meantime, another thanks again to Juliet and Andrea. Keep up the good work. If any of us can do anything to help you, we all hope you will let us know. Thanks everybody for coming. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you,
so
everyone.
much. Thank you.